The first thing she noticed was the way the floorboards trembled when he stepped closer. Not from fear alone, but from the weight of a man who looked carved out of the land itself. A giant cowboy with shoulders broad as barn doors and eyes like weathered iron, standing between her and every road that ever led out of Dustfall Crossing. And as the saloon's breath seemed to hold around them, Lila Boone felt the grit of her barefoot soles against the warped wood, and wondered how a life could narrow down to one moment so completely that even the past went silent. Because he spoke her name like it was already a promise broken and kept at the same time, telling her she would never struggle again if she gave him 5 strong sons, and the words did not sound like a bargain so much as a sentence handed down by the West itself. And she thought of her mother dying with red dust in her lungs, of her father buried without a marker beyond the dry creek, of the winters she survived by chewing boiled. Roots and hope. And she felt something in her chest twist, not disgust and not desire, but the ache of a door closing behind her, while around them men leaned against the bar pretending not to listen, even as every ear in the room strained, because everyone knew the giant. Amos Calder, a man who had buried 3 wives and built an empire of cattle and bone. A man said to be kind in his silences and merciless in his decisions, and Lila saw in his face the truth that he had not come to ask, but to declare. And she hated herself for noticing the softness hidden under the scar at his jaw, for sensing that he was tired in a way only men who carried too many ghosts ever were. And her hands shook as she held the rag she used to wipe tables, thinking how strange it was that such small hands had survived famine and fever, only to be weighed now against the future of sons not yet born. And as he leaned closer, she smelled leather and dust and the faint iron scent of blood long washed away. And he told her he had land that stretched farther than sorrow, a house that needed a woman's breath to wake it, and a name that could shield her from the cruelty of men who had already taken enough from her, and she wanted to spit at his boots and run. But her feet stayed planted because hunger teaches patience and the West teaches endurance, and somewhere behind her a glass shattered and she flinched, remembering the night her brother died over a card game he never wanted to play. And Amos watched that memory cross her face like a shadow of a cloud, and for a flicker of a second his voice softened as he said he would never strike her, never starve her, never abandon his children to the dirt. And she wondered if that was love or simply pride. And she realized with a cold clarity that love in this land often arrived disguised as necessity. And as the saloon's lamps hissed and flickered, she felt the eyes of the town carving her into a story they would tell for years. The barefoot girl who traded her youth for safety, and she hated them for their certainty, because none of them would carry the weight she was being asked to lift. And Amos straightened then, towering, as if giving her space that felt like another kind of trap, and he said she had until sundown to answer, because a man like him did not beg, and a woman like her did not have the luxury of time, and when he turned away the floorboards sighed in relief. But Lila's chest tightened, as if the air had gone thin, and she stared at his back, at the broad promise of it, and felt something dangerous stir. Not hope exactly, but the stubborn instinct to survive at any cost. And she remembered the stories her mother told about women who bent but did not break, who planted themselves like fence posts and let the storms wear themselves out. And she wondered if bearing 5 sons was just another kind of storm, one she could endure if it meant no more nights, listening to her stomach growl like a wild thing. And yet, as the saloon door swung open and daylight spilled in like a warning, she saw the road beyond it and felt the pull of a life she would never live, a life where her body belonged only to herself and her future was not counted in suns and seasons. And as Amos paused at the threshold and glanced back, their eyes met again, and in that silent exchange she saw not a villain but a man, afraid of dying alone, and that frightened her more than cruelty ever could, because it meant the choice before her was not on the barefoot and evil, but between 2 kinds of loss. And as the sun dipped lower, bleeding gold across the dust, Lila realized that whatever answer she gave would carve her fate deep into the bones of the land. And she stood there trembling, barefoot, and seen, knowing the West was watching, waiting to see whether she would step forward into his shadow or turn and face the long, merciless road alone. And the clock on the wall ticked louder with every heartbeat, counting down to a decision that would change everything. Sundown came like a held breath finally released, the sky bruising purple and fire as Lila Boone stepped off the porch of the saloon with dust clinging to her bare ankles and a decision burning heavier than any bundle she had ever carried. Because when she saw Amos Calder waiting by the hitching rail with his giant frame cut against the dying light, she knew she had already crossed the hardest distance, the one inside herself, and as she walked toward him she felt the town recede into murmurs and judgment that no longer mattered, only the creak of leather as he turned, surprise flickering through his iron-set face before settling into something quieter, almost reverent. And she told him she would go with him, but not as a thing bought with promises, that she would give what life gave her and no more, and if sons came, they would be raised with kindness, and if daughters came, they would be loved just the same. And for a long moment the West itself seemed to wait for his answer, the wind stirring dust devils like nervous spirits, until Amos nodded once, slow and heavy, saying that the land had taught him strength, but grief had taught him humility, and he swore then, not loudly and not for show, but with the solemn weight of a man laying down a rifle, that any child born under his roof would be protected with his life. And as they rode out together under a sky filling with stars, Lila felt fear still there, but no longer alone, because survival did not mean the absence of terror, but the courage to move through it. And the Calder Ranch rose from the darkness like a fortress shaped by years of labor and loneliness, its big house breathing dust and silence. And in the weeks that followed, she learned the rhythms of that place, the way dawn smelled of hay and sweat, the way Amos spoke little but listened deeply, and how grief lived in the corners of rooms where former wives had once laughed and then vanished into early graves claimed by fever and childbirth. And Lila carried that knowledge like a warning etched into her bones, choosing carefully how much of herself to surrender and how much to keep guarded. And the seasons turned, as the West always did, indifferent yet exacting. And when her first child came screaming into the world during a storm that split the sky, Amos held her hand with trembling strength, whispering gratitude into her hair when the baby's cry proved life had won another round. And she saw then that the promise of 5 sons had never been about numbers, but about leaving something living behind in a land obsessed with death. And more children followed in time. Not all sons as fate saw fit, but strong and stubborn and full of fire, raised to respect the land and the people who worked it. And Lila became more than a barefoot girl from Dustfall Crossing, becoming the steady heart of the ranch, the woman whose gaze could still a room and whose compassion softened a giant. And though hardship never truly left, because it never does in the West, struggle lost its sharpest teeth, replaced by purpose and a kind of hard-earned love that grew from shared labor and shared scars. And years later, when Amos's hair went gray and his steps slowed, he would sit on the porch watching their children ride out across land that now felt alive instead of haunted, and he would reach for Lila's hand with the same reverence he had shown the night she chose him. And she would think back to that ticking clock in the saloon and know she had not escaped fate, but shaped it, bending it just enough to survive without breaking. And as the story of the barefoot woman and the giant cowboy passed from mouth to mouth across campfires and generations, it carried a quiet truth about the West itself, that destiny is not always a chain, but sometimes a road you choose to walk with, eyes open and spine straight. And if this tale stirred something in you, if you felt the dust, the sacrifice, and the hard-won love of a land that never forgives, but sometimes rewards the brave, then ride with us again by subscribing to the Western Tales, where every story is carved from grit, heart, and the unbreakable spirit of the frontier.